Witness the exact moment Tulsi Gabbard looks Nancy Pelosi dead in the eye on national television and delivers a 4-page, handwritten resignation letter that permanently burns a 38-year political dynasty to the ground. What you are about to hear is the most personal political dismantling in American history, because the woman doing the dismantling used to be on the same side as the woman being dismantled. When Nancy Pelosi called Tulsi Gabbard a Putin puppet on live television, she thought she had buried the combat veteran from Hawaii forever. She didn't realize that the soldier she smeared had spent 2 years writing a resignation letter, and every line of that letter was an explosive aimed directly at Nancy Pelosi's the 12th 8-year empire of corruption. Smash that like button and subscribe, because in the next 45 minutes, you are going to watch a decorated combat veteran read her own resignation letter to the woman who made her write it. And by the time she reaches the last line, Nancy Pelosi's hands will be shaking so hard she can't hold a glass of water. And 6 Democrats will have left the room and not come back. The soldier who left is about to explain why she left, and the answer is sitting 12 feet away. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten on plain paper in the precise, angular script of a woman who had learned to write field reports under combat conditions. No flourishes, no wasted words, each sentence carrying exactly the weight it was designed to carry, and not an ounce more. Tulsi Gabbard had written it over 2 years, adding a line after every betrayal she witnessed, a paragraph after every principle she watched her party abandon, a page after every moment she realized that the organization she had sworn to serve was no longer serving the people it claimed to represent. And now, sitting 12 feet from the woman who embodied everything she had left behind, wearing the army dress blue uniform she had earned in a combat zone that Nancy Pelosi could not locate on a map without staff assistance. She was about to read it aloud, but to understand why a decorated combat veteran would write a resignation letter to her own party and then read it on national television to the woman she once called Madam Speaker, you have to go back 20 minutes, to the moment Nancy Pelosi looked at Tulsi Gabbard and said the 2 words that had haunted the soldier for 3 years, the 2 words that had cost her friends and allies and a political future. The 2 words that no combat veteran should ever have to hear from a politician who has never worn a uniform. Putin's puppet. The Senate Intelligence Committee hearing on political integrity and public trust had drawn an overflow crowd, which was unusual for a committee that typically conducted its most significant work behind closed doors. The reason for the public interest was not the topic. The reason was the matchup, and more specifically, the history between the 2 women who were about to face each other across 12 feet of polished mahogany. On one side, Nancy Pelosi, 84 years old, 38 years in Congress, 2 terms as Speaker of the House, retired but not gone, invited to testify as a senior Democratic voice on institutional integrity. She arrived with 4 attorneys, 3 staffers, and the unshakable confidence of a woman who had never lost a public confrontation that mattered. Her Chanel suit was slate gray. Her Mikimoto pearls were perfectly positioned. Her smile was the one she had been wearing since 1987, a smile that communicated authority, contempt, and absolute certainty that she was the most important person in any room she entered. On the other side, Tulsi Gabbard, 40 years old, former Democratic Congresswoman from Hawaii, former Vice Chair of the Democratic National Committee, combat veteran of the Iraq conflict, current Director of National Intelligence under President Trump. She wore her army dress blue uniform not because protocol required it, but because she wanted the cameras to see exactly what Nancy Pelosi had called a puppet of a foreign government. The combat infantry badge sat above her left breast pocket. The silver eagles on her shoulders caught the hearing room lights. Each decoration told a story that Pelosi could not understand, because Pelosi had never lived any of them. Between Tulsi's hands, resting on the witness table, was a folded piece of paper. 4 pages, handwritten, creased from being carried in a uniform pocket for 3 weeks. The chairman opened the hearing and invited former Speaker Pelosi to deliver her opening remarks. What followed was not an opening statement. It was a preemptive strike, the political equivalent of cratering the runway before the other side's planes can take off. Pelosi stood. She smoothed her jacket. She touched her pearls. And she looked at Tulsi Gabbard the way a museum director looks at a painting that has been hung in the wrong gallery. Director Gabbard. She paused on the title long enough to make clear she considered it illegitimate, and I use that title with grave concern for our national security. Let me be direct about something this committee needs to understand before we proceed. Her voice sharpened. You are a woman who left the Democratic Party to join Donald Trump's administration. A woman whose foreign policy positions have been praised by Russian state television. A woman whom my colleague, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, one of the most experienced foreign policy minds of our generation, identified as a potential Russian asset. She turned to face the cameras, ensuring the next line would be delivered directly to the American public. You stood on a Democratic debate stage and attacked your own party's nominees. You appeared on Tucker Carlson's program more frequently than any other Democrat in Congress. You opposed sanctions against Russia. You traveled to Syria and met personally with Bashar al-Assad, a notorious figure protected by Vladimir Putin, and you returned calling for dialogue. She turned back to Tulsi. So, before you presume to lecture anyone in this room about political integrity, perhaps you should explain to the American people why every significant foreign policy position you have taken in the last 6 years has aligned with the Kremlin's strategic interests. She sat down and delivered the final line with the timing of a woman who had been ending careers since before Tulsi was born. Putin's puppet doesn't become America's intelligence chief, Director Gabbard. It becomes a liability. The Democratic gallery applauded. Pelosi's legal team exchanged satisfied glances. Her communications director was already formatting the clip. The headline was writing itself. Tulsi did not speak for 8 seconds. 8 seconds of silence in a room full of cameras and microphones and 300 people holding their breath. 8 seconds during which the only movement was Tulsi's right hand, which rose slowly to her chest, to the combat infantry badge pinned above her breast pocket. She unclipped it. The small metal badge came free with a sound like a whisper. She placed it on the table between herself and Pelosi, face up so the cameras could see it. This badge means I was in combat, Mrs. Pelosi. Not a simulation, not a briefing room, not a committee hearing. Combat in Iraq in 2004. While you were in San Francisco raising money at a wine cave fundraiser, I was carrying an M16 in service to the flag you just accused me of betraying. Her voice was level. Not angry. Level. The voice of a woman who had learned to deliver situation reports while adversaries were firing at her unit, and had never seen a reason to raise the volume. You just called me Putin's puppet. You called a woman who served 2 tours in a combat zone, a woman who carried wounded Marines to safety under fire, a puppet of a foreign government, and you did it from a chair you've occupied for 38 years, without once wearing a uniform, without once carrying a weapon, without once wondering if you'd make it home alive. She picked up the folded paper from the table, held it between 2 fingers. I didn't come here to defend myself, Mrs. Pelosi. My service record defends itself. My combat badge defends itself. The scars I carry from Iraq defend themselves. I came here to read you a letter. She unfolded it. 4 pages. Handwritten. My letter. The one I wrote when I left the Democratic Party. The one I wrote over 2 years. 1 line for every deception I witnessed. 1 paragraph for every betrayal I couldn't stomach. 1 page for every principle your party abandoned while you got rich. She smoothed the first page flat on the table. I'm going to read it to you now, Mrs. Pelosi, line by line, and by the time I reach the last page, every American watching will understand exactly why I left and exactly who made me leave. She looked down at the letter. Line 1. I can no longer remain in a party that has become an elitist cabal, driven by cowardly posturing and a warmongering foreign policy. Let me tell you what that line means, and let me start with the word elitist, because nobody in this room has earned that word quite like you. Tulsi read the first line again slowly, so the words could carry their own weight. I can no longer remain in a party that has become an elitist cabal. She set the letter down and looked at Pelosi. When I was in Congress, Mrs. Pelosi, I attended the same caucus meetings you did. I sat in the same rooms. I heard the same briefings, and I watched from the inside as a fellow Democrat, as someone who believed in the party, how the machine actually worked. Every Tuesday morning, members received classified briefings, sensitive information about policy changes, regulatory actions, military deployments, information that could move markets, and every Tuesday afternoon, I watched those same members leave the briefing room and make phone calls, not to their constituents, not to community organizations, to their brokers. I never made those calls. Not because I'm better than anyone, because I was raised by my military training to believe that using privileged information for personal profit is called corruption. In the Army, it would get you court-martialed. In your caucus, it got people committee chairs. And nobody did it better than you. I remember a specific moment, January 2022, classified briefing on semiconductor policy, Chinese military threats to Taiwan, the CHIPS Act timeline. After the briefing, I walked past your office in the Capitol. The door was partially open. I didn't stop to eavesdrop. I'm not a spy, Mrs. Pelosi, despite what you've called me. But I heard you clearly on the phone, and you said, Hall, the semiconductor briefing just ended. Move on Nvidia before Thursday. She paused. I reported what I heard to my chief of staff. He told me to forget it. He said, that's how it works. 5 words. Mrs. Pelosi. That's how it works. 5 words that explain everything wrong with Washington. But I didn't forget it. And as Director of National Intelligence, I have had access to communications records from that period. She turned to the committee chairman. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to play 12 seconds of audio for this committee. The chairman nodded. Tulsi produced a small digital recorder. She pressed play. The room heard a voice. Unmistakably, Nancy Pelosi's voice. The cadence recognizable to anyone who had watched American politics in the last 4 decades. Paul, the semiconductor briefing just ended. Move on Nvidia before Thursday. The vote timeline is accelerating. 12 seconds. 12 seconds that detonated in the hearing room like a fragmentation device in a closed space. Pelosi's hand jerked toward her water glass. She didn't pick it up. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling visibly. The C-SPAN camera zoomed in, capturing the tremor in high definition, and then withdrew without touching the glass. Her chief counsel leaned over and whispered urgently in her ear. She didn't respond. The gallery erupted. The chairman gavelled for order. Reporters were typing so fast, the sound of keyboards filled the room like mechanical rain. 3 weeks after that phone call, Tulsi continued, her voice unchanged, still level, still military, still the voice of a field report. Your husband purchased between $1 and $5 million in Nvidia call options. 7 months later, the CHIPS Act passed. $52 billion in taxpayer subsidies to the semiconductor industry. Nvidia stock soared 40%. Your family's estimated profit, $4 million. She looked at the committee. $427 million. That's her current net worth on a congressional salary of $174,000. Assembled over 38 years, she beat Warren Buffett's returns by over 600%. She turned back to Pelosi. I was inside the machine, Mrs. Pelosi. I didn't need the Kremlin to tell me what I heard with my own ears in your own hallway. I just needed the courage to say it out loud, and it took me 2 years to find that courage. Because your party punishes people who tell the truth. You're demonstrating that right now by calling the person who tells the truth a puppet. A woman stood in the gallery. She was 67 years old, silver-haired, wearing a gold star pin on her lapel, the pin that identified her as the mother of a fallen service member. "My name is Patricia Dalton," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, the voice of a woman who had learned to speak in public only because grief had given her something that needed saying. "My son, Staff Sergeant Michael Dalton, lost his life in Iraq in 2005. The same deployment Director Gabbard served in." The room went silent. "She served beside my son's unit. She wrote me a letter after he passed away. A real letter, handwritten, telling me how brave he was. I still have it." She looked at Pelosi. "Mrs. Pelosi, you voted to send my son to Iraq. You voted for the conflict that ended his life. And then you called the woman who served beside him, the woman who wrote me a letter about his courage, a Russian puppet. My son would be ashamed of you. And I don't say that with hate. I say it with the certainty of a mother who knew her boy." She sat down. She did not cry. She was past crying. She had been past crying for 19 years. The silence after Patricia Dalton sat down lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds during which the hearing room confronted the distance between a gold star pin and a Mikimoto pearl necklace. Tulsi turned to the second page of her letter. Line 2. "A party that demonizes the police while failing to protect the people it claims to serve." Mrs. Pelosi, this line is about your district, San Francisco, the city you represented for 38 years, because I've been there, and what I saw made my second tour in Iraq look organized. If you're still listening, you just heard something no other hearing has ever produced. A recording of Nancy Pelosi telling her husband to buy stocks based on a classified briefing, and a gold star mother saying her fallen son would be ashamed. Hit that like button and comment, "I saw," if you think Tulsi just exposed the system from the inside. What comes next is about Pelosi's own city, and it's devastating. Tulsi read the line again. "A party that demonizes the police while failing to protect the people it claims to serve." In 2019, while I was still a Democrat, I visited San Francisco, your district. I wanted to see what 32 years of your representation had built. So I walked. Not with a security detail, not with staff. I walked alone. The way I walked patrol in Iraq, observing, assessing, taking notes, and Mrs. Pelosi, I have been to war zones. I have walked through neighborhoods in Fallujah, where governance had collapsed and institutions had failed. And what I saw in the Tenderloin in your district, the district you had represented for over 3 decades, reminded me of a deployment, not a democracy. Needles on the sidewalk, people unconscious on the pavement in broad daylight, human waste on the streets, open-air illicit markets operating within sight of police officers who had been instructed not to intervene. I counted 7 people injecting dangerous substances in a 4-block walk. In Iraq, we called that a failed state. In San Francisco, you called it progressive governance. When I returned to Washington, I called your office. I identified myself as a fellow Democrat and a sitting congresswoman, and I said, I wanted to discuss what I had observed in your district. Your office never returned the call. Pelosi's makeup had begun to shift. Not obviously, not in the way that cameras usually catch, but in the way that makeup shifts when the skin beneath it changes temperature. A flush was climbing her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her Chanel jacket. Her chief counsel whispered again. She waved him away. Then the pandemic came. Tulsi continued. And I watched from inside the caucus. I watched you support lockdowns that closed schools, shuttered churches, and destroyed small businesses. I watched you stand at press conferences talking about following the science while families were forbidden from visiting their passing parents in hospitals. And then I watched you walk into a hair salon, your salon in San Francisco, during your lockdown, without a mask. You broke the rules that you imposed on everyone else. And when the security camera footage leaked, when the American people saw their leader violating her own orders, you didn't apologize. You blamed the salon. I was on a phone call with National Guard leadership the morning that story broke. A young specialist, 22 years old from Kansas, told me his grandmother had passed away alone in a care facility because health protocols forbade visitors while you were getting a blowout. He asked me one question. Ma'am, do the rules only apply to regular people? And I couldn't answer him, because the honest answer was yes. In your party, the rules applied to everyone except the people who made them. And the freezer. I'm not going to spend long on the freezer, because the image speaks for itself. $12,000. Sub-Zero designer ice cream displayed on national television, while families in your own district were lining up at food banks. A man stood in the gallery. Vietnamese American. Mid-60s. Wearing a pressed shirt that was slightly too large, as if he had lost weight recently and not yet adjusted his wardrobe. My name is David Nguyen, he said. I owned a restaurant in the Tenderloin for 22 years, Pho Saigon. I closed during the lockdowns and never reopened. I couldn't afford it. 7 employees lost their jobs. My wife and I lost our savings. We moved to Sacramento. He paused. I voted for Mrs. Pelosi every election for 20 years. Every single one. She never came to my restaurant. Not once. But I voted for her because I believed she cared about our neighborhood. He held up his phone, showing a screenshot. This is her showing her freezer full of ice cream. I saw this on the day I told my employees I couldn't pay them. That was the last time I voted for her, and the last time I believed anybody in Washington was listening. He sat down. Pelosi reached for the water glass again. This time she picked it up. Her hand trembled. Not violently, but consistently, the way a hand trembles when the person it belongs to is no longer fully in control of the muscles that operate it. She brought the glass to her lips. She did not drink. She set it down, and a small amount of water sloshed over the rim onto the polished table. She stared at the small puddle. She did not wipe it up. Tulsi turned to page 3 of the letter. Line 3. A party controlled by warmongers who drag us into conflict after conflict. Mrs. Pelosi. This line is about Taiwan, and unlike everyone else who has criticized your Taiwan trip, I'm the only person in this room who has actually been fired upon. August 2022, you announced a congressional visit to Taiwan. The Pentagon advised against it. The State Department advised against it. The National Security Council advised against it. President Biden's own spokesperson said publicly that the military doesn't think it's a good idea right now. You went anyway. As Director of National Intelligence, I have reviewed the classified after-action assessment of your visit. I cannot share operational details in this setting, but I can tell you what your trip triggered. The largest Chinese military mobilization in the Taiwan Strait in 27 years. The Navy moved 2 carrier strike groups to the Western Pacific. Marine units across the Indo-Pacific were placed at elevated readiness. Fighter squadrons went to scramble alert. Submarines altered patrol patterns. Thousands of American service members, my brothers and sisters in uniform, went from peacetime operations to preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. Not a training exercise. Not a drill, the real thing. A friend of mine, a Navy lieutenant commander stationed in Okinawa, texted me that week. She said her husband had packed a go-bag. Their 6-year-old asked why Daddy was leaving. He said, "A woman in Washington is taking a trip." The 6-year-old asked, "Is the trip dangerous?" And the husband said, "Only for us." Tulsi looked at Pelosi. Your husband's stock portfolio was positioned in defense contractors, semiconductor companies, and rare earth mineral suppliers before you boarded the plane. Every sector aligned perfectly with the crisis your visit would create. You didn't go to Taiwan for democracy, Mrs. Pelosi. You went for content. You went for the photograph. You went for the headline, "Brave Pelosi stands up to China." And you went knowing that the military would have to clean up whatever mess your photo opportunity created, and that your husband would profit from the volatility. Pelosi erupted. She stood, and the old Pelosi surfaced. The Pelosi who had indeed stared down presidents, who had indeed torn up a State of the Union address on live television, who had indeed been the most powerful woman in Washington for the better part of 2 decades. Director Gabbard, you met with Bashar al-Assad, a man who attacked his own people, a man who used prohibited methods on children, on neighborhoods, on hospitals. You shook hands with a notorious figure, and you came back to Washington calling for dialogue. Her voice shook with what appeared to be genuine fury. That is why we called you what we called you. Not because you disagreed with us. Because you chose to stand with a monster. You sat across from a man who ends the lives of children, and you called it diplomacy. The Democratic gallery exploded. Standing ovation. Pelosi's supporters were on their feet, applauding with the full-throated conviction of people who believed their champion had just landed the decisive blow, because she had a point. Tulsi had met with Assad. That was real. That was documented. That was the one piece of ammunition that had followed Tulsi for years and had never been fully diffused. 15 seconds of genuine dangerous momentum. The hearing room belonged to Nancy Pelosi. Tulsi waited. Not with the performed patience of a politician calculating her response, with the actual patience of a soldier who has been under fire and knows that the first person to panic is the first person to perish. I went to Syria, Mrs. Pelosi. Her voice was quiet, because I wanted to know the truth. Not your truth. Not the briefing book truth. Not the truth that defense contractors pay lobbyists to tell you. The truth you can only see with your own eyes, on the ground. Yes, I met with Assad. And I also walked through neighborhoods he destroyed. I met with mothers who had lost children to severe violence. I visited hospitals that had been targeted by his Air Force. I saw the conflict not from a committee room in Washington, but from the rubble, and when I came home and said, maybe endless regime change conflicts, the kind that cost 4,000 American lives in Iraq and destabilized the entire Middle East, are not in America's interest. That is when you called me a Russian asset. Not because I was wrong, because I was inconvenient, because a combat veteran questioning the military-industrial complex is dangerous to people who profit from it, and nobody profits from it more than members of Congress whose husbands hold defense stocks. She held up the letter. You used Assad as a weapon against me, Mrs. Pelosi. But let me ask you this. How many people lost their lives in Syria after your party voted to arm rebel groups that turned out to be affiliated with extremists? How many American weapons ended up in the hands of dangerous factions because your caucus approved the shipments? You didn't stop Assad. You prolonged the conflict. And you called anyone who questioned that prolongation a traitor. Pelosi sat down. The 15 seconds of momentum had evaporated like water on a hot engine block. Her chief counsel was writing notes furiously. Two of her staffers were already on their phones in the hallway. One of them, the deputy communications director, was later confirmed to have been updating her LinkedIn profile. The physical transformation was accelerating. Pelosi's left hand, the one that had torn up a president's State of the Union address with surgical steadiness on live television, was now gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The Mikimoto pearls had shifted again, catching in the collar of her Chanel jacket, and she reached up to adjust them. A habitual, almost unconscious gesture, but her fingers fumbled the clasp, and she stopped trying. A strand of hair dislodged by the motion fell across her forehead. She did not fix it. The woman who had never appeared on camera with a hair out of place for 38 years now had one hanging across her face like a crack in porcelain. The cameras saw everything. The photographers in the press gallery, who had been shooting Pelosi for decades and knew every angle of her public face, understood that they were capturing something that had never existed before. Nancy Pelosi losing. Tulsi turned to the 4th page of her letter. Line 4 is the hardest one I wrote, because line 4 isn't about policy or corruption or foreign wars. Line 4 is about what you did to me personally, and to every person who ever dared disagree with you. She read, "A party that attacks anyone who doesn't fall in line. Let me tell you what falling out of line cost me." What comes next is the most personal chapter in this entire story. When Tulsi explains what the Putin puppet label actually did to her life, the friends she lost, the career she sacrificed, the Gold Star event she was banned from, you will understand why she spent 2 years writing this letter. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss the last line. In 2019, I stood on a Democratic debate stage and criticized my party's direction. I said the forever wars needed to end. I said regime change had failed. I questioned the establishment consensus, the consensus that you represented, Mrs. Pelosi. Within days, your ally Hillary Clinton went on a podcast and said I was being groomed by the Russians. She called me a Russian asset. Not metaphorically, not as political hyperbole. She told the American people that a sitting congresswoman, a combat veteran, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, was a foreign agent, and you said nothing. You didn't call her office and say, "Whatever our disagreements, Tulsi Gabbard served in combat, and it's wrong to call her a Russian puppet." You didn't defend a fellow Democrat. You didn't defend a fellow woman. You said nothing, and your silence was a signal. It told every Democrat in Washington, if you cross us, we will call you a traitor. If you question the machine, we will destroy you. If you break ranks, we will take everything. And you did. Tulsi's voice did not change, did not rise, did not crack. She delivered the next sentences with the same flat precision she would have used to read a casualty report, because that is essentially what they were. Within 1 week of the Russian asset smear, I lost 14 congressional allies who stopped returning my calls. 3 committee assignments were removed. I was excluded from caucus strategy sessions. My fundraising dropped by 62% in a single quarter, because donors were told that supporting me meant supporting Russia. My staff received severe threats. My family in Hawaii was harassed. My father's business in Honolulu was boycotted by people who had never met him, but who had read on Twitter that his daughter was a traitor. And this is the one that I carried with me, the one that made me start writing line 4. I was disinvited from a Gold Star family's event. She paused. Not for drama, for the weight of it. A Gold Star event, Mrs. Pelosi. an event honoring families who lost sons and daughters in combat. I was disinvited because the organizers were afraid of being associated with someone your machine had labeled a Russian asset. I was banned from honoring the fallen soldiers who served in the same war I served in, who bled on the same ground I bled on, because your political apparatus decided that a combat veteran who disagreed with you was more dangerous than the enemies those soldiers passed away fighting. Patricia Dalton, the Gold Star mother from earlier, was crying silently. Her Gold Star pin caught the light. I lost my party, my committee seats, my fundraising, my reputation in Washington, my invitation to honor the fallen. And what did you lose, Mrs. Pelosi? She held up the single sheet of paper she had carried. Her financial disclosure summary: nothing. You lost nothing. In the same period that I was being called a Russian agent and losing everything, your net worth increased by approximately $73 million. You gained a vineyard in Napa Valley. You gained a mansion renovation. You gained a 7th consecutive term as the most powerful woman in Washington. I paid the price for honesty. You were rewarded for corruption. That is the system, Mrs. Pelosi. And you didn't just benefit from it. You built it. A woman stood from the back of the gallery. She was in her 40s, wearing a dark suit, and she was visibly nervous. The nervousness of a person who is about to end a career. Not someone else's, but their own. My name is Karen Sheffield, she said. I worked in Speaker Pelosi's office for 7 years. Legislative Director. I left in 2021. The room went still. Everything Director Gabbard has described is accurate. The phone calls after briefings. The atmosphere of retaliation against anyone who questioned leadership. The informal blacklisting of members who broke ranks. I saw it. I participated in it. I enforced it. And I am ashamed. She looked at Pelosi. I left because I couldn't look at myself anymore. I left because what we were doing wasn't public service. It was power maintenance. And the people who paid the price were always the ones who told the truth. She sat down. Her hands were shaking. She had just made herself unemployable in Democratic politics. She knew it. She did it anyway. Pelosi's face had undergone a transformation that the cameras captured in clinical detail. The flush that had started at her neck had reached her cheeks. The composure that she had maintained for 38 years of public life, through impeachments and shutdowns and presidential confrontations, was fracturing in real time. Her left hand gripped the armrest of her chair. Her right hand rested on the table next to the water puddle she had not wiped up. Tulsi looked at the last page of her letter. The last line. The one I wrote on the day I finally mailed the letter. The day I left the Democratic Party and never looked back. She read, I believe in a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people, but I can no longer serve in a party that is of the elite, by the elite, and for the elite. She set the letter down. Mrs. Pelosi, after 38 years, $427 million, the destruction of every person who challenged you. I have one question. Name one person. One ordinary person. Not a donor. Not a lobbyist. Not a Hollywood executive. Not a defense contractor. One person from your district. One teacher. One small business owner. One veteran. One mother whose life is better today because of your 38 years in Congress. Silence. 5 seconds. 8 seconds. Name one. Mrs. Pelosi. 12 seconds. Pelosi's mouth opened, closed. Her hand reached for the water glass, then stopped. She had already spilled it once. She couldn't risk it again. Not with every camera in the room focused on her hands. Of 15 seconds. I served with Marines who lost their lives at 22, Tulsi said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone carried it everywhere. To the gallery, to the cameras, to every living room in America. They didn't sacrifice their lives for your stock portfolio. They didn't lay down their lives for your ice cream freezer. They didn't pass away for your vineyard, or your pearls, or your hair appointment during lockdown. She picked up the combat infantry badge from the table, held it in her open palm. They gave everything for this, for something you've never understood. Service, not the kind that comes with a return on investment, the kind that costs you everything and pays you nothing, except the right to look at yourself in the mirror. She placed the badge back on the table with a small click that sounded in the silence of the hearing room like a door closing. That's why I left your party, Mrs. Pelosi. Not because Putin told me to, because my conscience did. And a conscience, unlike a stock portfolio, doesn't appreciate in value. It just tells you the truth, whether you want to hear it or not. Nancy Pelosi made one last attempt. Her voice was stripped of the authority it had carried for 38 years, scraped raw by the last 90 minutes of testimony and evidence and witnesses, and the 1-2-second audio recording that was at that very moment being broadcast on every major network and shared across every social media platform on Earth. You are a traitor to the democratic ideal. I was a traitor to your machine, Mrs. Pelosi. Tulsi's response was immediate and level. Not to the democratic ideal. The democratic ideal says government of the people. Your version says government of the Pelosis. Those are different things. And the two-year-old Marine who never returned from Anbar province knew the difference, even if you've forgotten it. Tulsi stood. She picked up the letter. All 4 pages creased and worn. Each line a scar from a betrayal she had witnessed. She folded it carefully, the way a soldier folds a flag. Precise, deliberate, with respect for what the document represents, even when what it describes is ugly. Then she did something that nobody in the room expected. She walked around the witness table. She walked past the committee dais. She walked across 12 feet of hearing room floor, 12 feet that felt to the 300 people watching like the longest walk in congressional history. She stopped in front of Nancy Pelosi's table. She placed the letter on the table, gently, carefully, the way a soldier places a notification on a family's doorstep, with the understanding that what is being delivered will change everything, and that the person delivering it takes no pleasure in the delivery. That's my resignation letter, Mrs. Pelosi. You never read it. 14 million Americans did. But the person it was written for, the person who made me write every line, never saw it. She straightened, military posture, shoulders back. Now you have. She turned and walked back to the witness table. She picked up the combat infantry badge. She pinned it back on her uniform, above her heart, where it belonged, where it had been earned, in a place that Nancy Pelosi had never been and would never go. The committee chairman cleared his throat. The committee will refer all matters related to financial disclosures and securities trading to the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The committee will additionally refer the audio evidence presented today to the Senate Ethics Committee for authentication and review. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel fell. The Democrats left. Not all at once, but in a cascade that accelerated as each departure gave the next person permission to flee. First, the junior members, moving quickly, heads down, avoiding the press. Then, the mid-ranking allies, walking with the studied casualness of people trying to look like they had somewhere else to be. Then, the committee co-chair, who left through a side door without making a statement. A silence that was itself a statement. 6 seats empty within 4 minutes. The evacuation had the coordinated feel of a building being abandoned before a storm. Not panicked, but purposeful. each person calculating the minimum distance they needed to establish between themselves and the wreckage. But one person stayed, a young Democratic Congresswoman from Michigan, first term, 31 years old. The youngest woman on the committee remained in her seat while her colleagues filed out. She watched Tulsi pin the combat badge back on her uniform. She watched Pelosi stare at the letter. She watched the hearing room empty around her, and she stayed. When the room was nearly clear, she stood, walked to the witness table, and leaned close to Tulsi. The microphones were off, but a lip-reading analyst later confirmed what she whispered. "I'm on line 1 of my own letter." She left before anyone could ask her what she meant. But Tulsi knew, and the look they exchanged. Brief, steady, the look of two people who understand each other because they have both seen the same machine from the inside, said more than the entire hearing had said in 90 minutes. Karen Sheffield, the former Pelosi staffer, was seen in the hallway leaning against a wall, eyes closed, breathing the way people breathe when they have just done the hardest thing they will ever do. Patricia Dalton, the Gold Star mother, remained in her seat until the room was nearly empty. She was holding her Gold Star pin. She was not crying anymore. Nancy Pelosi sat at the witness table for 90 seconds after the gavel. Her attorneys spoke to her. She did not respond. She stared at the letter, the 4 handwritten pages that Tulsi Gabbard had placed in front of her, the pages that contained every reason a combat veteran had left the party that Pelosi had built and controlled and profited from for 38 years. She did not pick it up. She stood. She walked to the exit. Her pearls had shifted during the hearing. The Mikimoto strand that had been perfectly positioned at the beginning was now slightly askew. One pearl caught in the collar of her Chanel jacket. She did not fix it. She left the room. And the letter remained on the table unread. The way that truth often remains, present, visible, and ignored by the person who needs it most. Nancy Pelosi's office released a statement at 9:40 p.m. that evening. Today's hearing was a politically motivated exercise, orchestrated by partisan actors with a clear agenda. Speaker Emerita Pelosi's record of public service speaks for itself. 3 sentences. The word partisan appeared twice. The word misinformation appeared once. The letter was not mentioned. The audio recording was not mentioned. The Gold Star mother was not mentioned. No Democrat endorsed the statement. Her personal phone, according to sources who later spoke to the press, received 0 calls from congressional allies that evening. 0. For the first time in 38 years, the most powerful woman in Washington was completely alone. The soldier flew home to Hawaii. Not to Washington, not to a victory celebration, not to a press conference or a cable news appearance, or any of the post-hearing rituals that politicians perform to capitalize on a moment. She flew home to the island where she was born, to the ocean where she had learned to swim before she learned to walk, to the silence that exists only in places where the land ends and the water begins. The hashtags appeared before her plane landed. The soldier who left at number 1, line by line at number 2. A third hashtag, Putin's puppet was right, occupied the number 3 position for 16 hours, a phrase that carried the bitter satisfaction of vindication and the quiet sadness of someone who had been proven right only after paying the full price for saying what she saw. The audio recording of Pelosi's move on Nvidia before Thursday was played on every major network by midnight. Legal analysts debated its admissibility. Financial analysts mapped it against Paul Pelosi's trading records. The correlation was described by a Bloomberg commentator as either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of financial markets or the most straightforward case of insider trading since Martha Stewart. Karen Sheffield's testimony was published in full by 3 newspapers the following morning. She gave no further interviews. She did not need to. She had said what she needed to say, and the saying of it had freed her from something she had been carrying for 7 years. Patricia Dalton returned to her home in Virginia. On her kitchen table she had a letter. Not Tulsi's resignation letter, but the one Tulsi had written 19 years earlier after her son lost his life in Iraq. She read it again that night. Then she placed it next to the gold star pin and went to bed. She slept better than she had in months. Tulsi landed in Honolulu at 11 p.m. Hawaii time. She drove to the North Shore in the dark. Windows down. The salt air. She did not check her phone. At 5 a.m., she was standing on the beach at Pipeline. The sun was still below the horizon, but the sky was beginning to lighten. The deep purple of pre-dawn shifting to the steel blue that comes just before the first gold edge of sunrise appears above the water. She carried a surfboard under her arm, an old one. Dings in the fiberglass. Wax built up in layers from years of use. Not a prop, not content. A surfboard that had been ridden 1,000 times by a woman who needed the ocean the way other people needed applause. She paddled out alone. Nobody else on the water. Just her, the board, the ocean, and the silence that exists only between waves. The silence that is not empty, but full of everything the ocean knows and does not say. She sat on the board, legs dangling in the warm Pacific water, and watched the sunrise. She thought about the letter. 4 pages. 2 years of writing. 1 afternoon of reading. Done. A wave came. A clean, glassy wall of water, the kind that Pipeline produces on its good mornings, the kind that tourists photograph and surfers live for. She paddled, caught it, rose to her feet with the balance of a woman who had been doing this since she was 7, and who understood in her bones that the ocean is the one place where there are no committees, no gavels, no cameras, and no politicians. She rode the wave to shore. She fell. She got back up. She paddled out again. That was the thing about the ocean. It didn't care about Washington. It didn't care about hearings or hashtags or $427 million. It just moved forward, always forward. The way soldiers move, the way truth moves, the way the world keeps going, even when the people running it have forgotten which direction forward is. A reporter was waiting on the beach, a Honolulu Star Advertiser correspondent who had driven to the North Shore at 4 a.m. on the chance that Tulsi would show up at her favorite break. She was right. Director Gabbard? Was today personal? Tulsi toweled off her surfboard, leaned against her truck, fins up the way she always stored it. The letter was personal. The hearing was professional. The difference matters because Mrs. Pelosi never learned it. She made everything personal. Personal wealth, personal power, personal revenge against anyone who disagreed. I tried to keep it professional. She paused. But when someone calls you a puppet of a foreign government, when they try to erase your service to this country because you dared to disagree, it becomes personal. Not by your choice, by theirs. What do you want people to remember? Tulsi looked at the ocean. The sun was fully up now, painting the water gold and blue and white. A set was rolling in. 4 waves, each one building on the one before it. The way truth builds when enough people finally say it out loud. That leaving is not losing. That the people who stay silent inside a corrupt system are not heroes, they're hostages. And that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't pick up a weapon, it's pick up a pen and write the truth on a piece of paper, even when it costs you everything. She picked up her board, walked toward the water. Even when it costs you everything, she said again, quieter this time, to the ocean more than to the reporter, because everything is what it cost, and I'd pay it again tomorrow. The soldier who left had delivered her letter, not with a weapon, not with classified intelligence, not with the authority of her office or the power of her position. With 4 pages of handwritten truth and a combat badge, she placed on a table to remind the most powerful woman in Washington that some debts cannot be paid with stock options, and some oaths cannot be broken by calling the person who keeps them a puppet. If you made it this far, you just heard the most personal political story we've ever told. A combat veteran reading her own resignation letter to the woman who made her write it, line by line, page by page, until there was nothing left to say, and a letter left on a table that Nancy Pelosi still hasn't picked up. Smash that like button if you believe that leaving a corrupt system takes more courage than staying in it. Subscribe because there are more stories coming, and the next one will be just as powerful. Comment line by line if you think Tulsi just delivered the truth Washington needed to hear. And share this with every American who has ever been punished for telling the truth, because they need to know they're not alone. The soldier who left didn't lose. She won the only thing that matters, the right to look at herself in the mirror and see someone who kept her oath. Semper Fi. Always faithful, even when it costs you everything.